Right. Today, I'm going to attempt something that I've been somewhat reticent to get into because I feel quite caught between, what I would consider to be a scientific way of thinking and a decidedly not scientific way of thinking. And I feel that I need to attempt to bridge those in my own way. So this is not a topic or a publication, a sharing, an expression, which is suitable for anyone who has sort of already made up their minds on this particular topic. It's for people who are genuinely open-minded and willing to be, yeah, at least initially charitable in approaching this particular topic as a, earnest attempt to understand a couple of the different perspectives that are involved. Of course, I'm still trying to understand Jung and Jung's relevance, and my reason for approaching the topic of astrology is that I I know enough people in my life that derive meaning from that style of sense making that I find the sort of automatic scientistic dismissal of that way of thinking to be not adequate. And so I want to look deeper and figure out like what's going on here. Why do people find this attractive or important? Why has as a system astrology emerged repeatedly as one of the oldest ways of making sense, across different civilizations, both ancient and modern, and around the world. When systems emerge independently in different places, it's usually an indication that there's some kind of truth there. One other example is the chakra system independently emerging in India, China, and Egypt. Yeah, and so I find that the scientific reductive approach of saying, oh no, that's clearly just a silly pseudoscientistic, um, pseudoscientific form of self-deception that has no basis in quote unquote reality. I don't find that to be adequate. I find that it has elements of truth that I'd like to explore. And I feel that in some way, the ancient world may and the ancient mind may have had a better understanding of this particular topic and how to approach it, and that we may have been unhelpfully cut off from understanding it as a result of modernity, and holding at the same time that there have been important developments in sense making as a result of modernity that can help us to approach this with more care, that is not equivalent to more dismissal. And I feel that in some way, obviously, it's an incredibly popular way of making sense. And I'm trying to sort of dig into this morass and look between the lines a bit and try to maybe sort of steelman both sides of this to understand at least what Jung is talking about and how Jung would approach this. The relevance is because I feel that as someone with a scientific background and scientific training, I have a responsibility to know what I'm talking about when I object. I want to know why to object and how. And at the same time, I am in relationship with people who rely on this way of making sense, and I'm trying to enter that perspective, enter that way of seeing, as a way of taking on or appropriating that perspective so as to better understand it and therefore evaluate it. And if I don't allow myself to properly participate in that way of seeing and being in the world, in that way of understanding, then I don't think that I'm really in a position to assess. And so Jung is going to help us try and bridge this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read the very short section which describes, this is in a compilation which is called Jung on Astrology, selected and introduced by Safron, Rossi, and Keiron, Grice. Safron Rossi, PhD, is a professor of mythology and depth psychology in the Jungian archetypal studies specialization at Pacifica Graduate Institute, California. For many years, she was the curator of the Joseph Campbell and James Hillman manuscript collections, and she writes in the fields of archetypal psychology, mythology, and astrology. While Keiron Grice, PhD, is a professor of depth psychology and program chair in the Jungian archetypal studies specialization at Pacifica Graduate Institute, California, and co-founder of the Institute of Transpersonal and Archetypal Studies. He's author of several books and a founding editor of Archive, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit of the author's approach to what is astrology, go through its relevance and history in the Western world over a couple of paragraphs, not very long, and I go into the main objections that come up, and then go into the 7 different ways that Jung is summarized as approaching the topic and try to discuss each in turn. And let's see what that will reveal. So, what is astrology? Quote, simply stated, astrology is the practice of interpreting the meaning of observed correlations between human experience and the positions, interrelationships, and cycles of the planets, including the sun and the moon in the solar system. The movements and positions of the planets are plotted against the zodiac, a symbolic frame of reference based on the ecliptic, the line formed by the apparent movement of sun around the Earth over the course of the year. So to me, it kind of helps to visualize this so I can really understand what's going on. So it's like we're on a planet Earth. This is our, this is our worldview. This is our cosmology. We're standing right now on a great ball of, lava and rock that we call Earth. And from our position here on Earth, we can see that these planets, including the sun, move around, and they move around the Earth against a background of stars that we give sort of symbolic meaning to some of the different planets as they move, and we also give symbolic meaning to some of the constellations of stars as they generally remain still. Okay, and so it's about the relationships between the planets and the constellations as the planets move. Okay. So I said the movements and positions of the planets plotted against the zodiac, a symbolic frame of reference based on the ecliptic, a line formed by the apparent movement of sun around the Earth over the course of a year. This apparent movement, of course, as astronomers have known since the Copernican revolution, is a result of the Earth's orbit around the sun. In astrology, the ecliptic forms the centerline of an imaginary band extending 8 to 9 degrees above and below it. So it's a band, a section of the constellations that contains the well-known signs of the zodiac. And it's accordingly that zodiacal band is divided into 12 32-degree segments. This is maybe not the most important, but this is just like basics to understand what's going on here. Yep. And so each of these, the 12 signs, belongs to one of the 4 elements, fire, earth, air, and water, and they're thought to possess qualities in keeping with the nature of that element in some way. And so the qualities of these signs, the 12 signs, are thought to influence the astrological meanings and the principles associated with each of the orbiting planets. So again, I'm going to say the next sentence. The qualities of the signs are thought to influence the astrological meanings and principles associated with each of the orbiting planets, as they appear to move around the zodiac through each sign in turn. The planets themselves are symbolically associated with certain dynamic principles and powers. Jung likened them to gods and archetypes, whereas the signs might be construed as something like modes of being or archetypal styles manifest in enduring personality traits. Okay, so already this is a lot of material to try to assess. So again, we just mentioned that there are each of these 12 signs that possess apparently that it's symbolically infused with different qualities, and the planets too are symbolically associated with different qualities. Jung regards those planets as constellations of archetypal forces. Okay, well, what do we mean by that? Yeah, so the nature of archetypes. I think like what I want to connect here is that the human capacity to create categories by classifying things into groups is very old, and that when we do that, there is a tendency for those categories to be so the form of cognition that creates categories in that way, categorization, is deeply interrelated with the categorization that is involved in our social cognition. So our social cognition and our categorizing go together and are both very, very old. And this is why I think we see this tendency for categories to be created, and not only created, but derived from like the oldest categories that we make are categories that are based on these social patterns that people are sort of most commonly exposed to over evolutionary time, namely categories like father and mother. And so the social quality of those categories, like our capacity to personify them, I think is deeply related with our social cognition. A modern example of this sort of thing is Tom Hanks in Castaway makes a person out of the basketball because that's what people do. We make faces out of things and we make these categories, and when we personify those categories, I think that's what an archetype is. That's our modern notion of an archetype. Jung obviously regards these personified forces as kind of unconsciously influencing the quote-unquote conscious ego. That's probably enough about archetypes. So the idea is like why are they connected with the planets, or why do these different zodiacal signs have uh, archetypal meaning? Well, that's a good question. I think the most honest answer is I don't know. I think um, Jung is going to try and explain some of that. My way of approaching that would be to observe that the planets and the stars are some of the most invariant features of the world in which humans have been embedded. Like in the same way as I was talking about the units, like the elements of a family as being constant or unchanging. Well, the planets and the stars are also somewhat unchanging in that way. And I could see why, over vast evolutionary time, specific constellations and specific planets could come to be um, understood, or there's a way that, like when we talk about the mother, for example, well, the mother as an archetype is a collection of all of the different attributes that we associate with the archetype of mother. Um, And similarly, I can see how the planets are a equivalent version to that. But there's still the question of why those qualities with those bodies, and I don't know. We're hoping that Jung will tell us. But the idea would be that those planets in some way are constellations or, yeah, aggregations of archetypal forces that have different qualities that are specific. And that's an interesting idea. It doesn't really make sense, but I want to understand what Jung has to say about it. We also noticed that, yeah, the constellations are obviously vary between cultures. And so I think it's quite important that that zodiacal band it's a symbolic frame of reference. So I would want to maybe talk about more about how the human mind, through its embeddedness, through its embedding in the quote unquote natural world, derives meaning from that natural world. And yes, it can't ultimately be that it's just a human construct. It's co-created by these interactions with the human and the world itself. But this is at least like by talking about these phenomena in terms of archetypes, this is a way that helps me to understand what's really going on here. The question of whether it's actually relevant to personality is, I think, something that can be deeply challenged. I think what I want to maybe say here about the relevance is that Jung has this notion of the collective unconscious, which is the aspect of the unconscious which is shared or not unique. And I think we can maybe see that the forces that are indicated with these, through astrology, those archetypal forces, they're maybe in the collective field, the collective unconscious, but it may be less relevant to individual personality. Um, like it's definitely one way of approaching personality that can yield insight, but there are also other ways of approaching personality that may be equally or more interesting or valid. And so I would say I'm more interested in astrology's relevance to the archetypal dynamics of the collective unconscious. So I'm just going to read the rest of this section. It says, traditional astrology was concerned only with the seven planets known to classical antiquity, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Contemporary astrology, in many of its forms, has incorporated into its symbolism and practice the so-called modern planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And so, as seen from any viewpoint on Earth, each planet in its orbit appears to pass in turn through each sign of the zodiac, such that at any given moment, a planet will be positioned in one particular sign, forming a configuration of relationships with the other planets, known as aspects. For instance, if two planets appear close to each other in the zodiac within a range of about 10 to 12 degrees conjunction, this is deemed significant, indicating that the principles and qualities associated with those planets are in a powerful dynamic relationship, stimulating and blending with each other. Similarly, two planets approximately opposite each other, yes, it just talks about the different configurations of relationships. Yeah, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 120 degrees, and 60 degrees. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. All the planets in their interrelationships are depicted in an astrological chart calculated for any given moment in time. Yep. So, and then alongside the annual passage of the sun around the zodiacal band, astrology utilizes another frame of reference based on our experience of the sun's apparent daily motion across the sky. And so it talks about how, yep, the line of the sun's journey across the course of a day forms a circle, which is divided into the 12 houses. I'm not going to go into that here, mostly because someone like, a pretty famous archetypal astrologer like Richard Tarnas didn't use the houses in Cosmos and Psyche 2006. And so I don't think it's as interesting. So I'm not going to focus on that part of it. Probably going to move on here. Yeah, and so Western astrology, with which Jung is almost exclusively concerned, is thought to have originated in Mesopotamia around 3400 BCE. From there, it was transmitted to Egypt, Greece, and Rome, assimilating the character of the deities of those traditions in a form of mythic syncretism, with the planets ultimately taking on the names of the well-known Roman gods and goddesses: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So that's quite interesting. So we have these, like the notion of the gods as these, again, constellations of sort of unconscious archetypal forces that are assimilated with those unconscious archetypal forces that apparently constellate around planets. And so this is what, like a way of understanding it is that the planets are sort of um, features of the natural world that seem to exhibit some independent agency than humans because they move around of their own accord. And like I can see why over a very long period of time, phenomena like that come to be infused with, like they come to collect this archetypal numinous forces around them. Why they would have different qualities is beyond me. Okay, so after a period of suppression by the church, when Christianity became established as the official religion of the Roman Empire, astrology then underwent a revival during the Middle Ages, flourishing again during the Renaissance. Marsilio Ficino was an influential figure, and then obviously it's not been included in science after the Enlightenment. Okay, and so for some practitioners, astrology is to be viewed as a divinatory method akin to the I Ching or the Tarot, and for others, it's a way to develop psychological insight and a source of mythic meaning. So there are different ways to approach it, and that's what we're going to be hoping to explore a bit. So what are the main objections here? So quite, especially in academia and science, the prevailing view today, however, is that astrology is a pseudoscience whose premises are incompatible with the accepted scientific understandings on the nature of reality. Although three of the progenitors of the modern scientific era, Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, were themselves involved in astrology in the period of 16th and early 17th centuries, in which astronomy and astrology was still a single discipline, the direction of scientific development thereafter pushed astrology outside the margins of the accepted paradigmatic boundaries of intellectual discourse, where it remains. One central element in the debunking of astrology is the absence of a satisfactory causal explanation in terms of known forces as to how planets can influence human beings on Earth. So I'm pausing here. So what I want to talk about is, I think, yeah, science is sort of like trying to move forward out of the different dualistic traps that we've inherited through Descartes as a result of the Enlightenment, right? And so we're sort of trying to preserve from the Enlightenment what we've gained, but also correct a number of the dualisms that we've inherited. And I think as that happens, and as I think I want to say, as we see more group practice get involved in people's lives, as we see more of this like wisdom school model, I think perspectives on astrology are going to become more prevalent. And having a way for a scientific mind to approach something like this is not only a helpful bridge in relationships, but it's also a way to try to see if there's anything that we're missing here, that we've lost, that we can't see because of the way that science has been cloaking our point of view, and vice versa, how an understanding of modern science can help us to debride thinking that isn't very helpful, let's say. So that would be where I see this going and where I see it becoming more relevant over time. So then we had the first objection, which is that, hey, you're supposed to have a causal explanation for how there's a relationship between planets and human beings. I think, yeah, and so I don't see why that's really, I don't think that, for me, like, there would be, like, I'm not making any claims, and I hope no one else, like, obviously they are making claims about the causal relationship. I think that's unlikely to hold up. So it would be better not to make a causal claim. It's something, it's like, I think the notion of planets or signs of the zodiac as sort of agglomerations of archetypal psychic energy, that is a way for me to see how um, it's a symbolic, I mean, let's say at the moment, representation of forces which are actually within us that are not coming from the external world. That's one way to approach that. So that would mean that we don't need we're not looking for a causal explanation. There are then five other objections, which I'm going to briefly run through and then get into Jung, how Jung is approaching this. Yeah, so other critiques concern the apparent lack of empirical evidence to substantiate astrology's truth claims, a critique Jung himself made and sought to address. That's probably the most serious objection. Like, if they're making claims and they don't have evidence to support those claims, then that's a pretty good indication that the claims are not true. And so we would maybe want to clarify or like rein in exactly what claims are being made um, to be on firmer ground. And then I think the next step would be to say, at the same time as that, if if I'm correct that astrology is going to be maybe more relevant to collective dynamics, then we may have been assessing it in the wrong way. And we may need to like there may like the relevance of it may involve significant change to the truth claims that are being made and the evidence that is submitted to, substantiate those truth claims. But it's still a substantial objection, as in the a lot of the way that it's often presented is not something that I would seek to defend necessarily. Okay, it then goes on. So that was the second of six. More broadly, with its apparent permutation of archaic notions of fate and predestination, astrology is at odds with a number of foundational assumptions of the modern worldview, such as the belief in rational self-determination and causality. If we're self-determining agents with the capacity to shape the future through acts of free will, how can our lives be fated and controlled by the movements of the planets in the solar system? I think that's a reasonable objection, but I also notice that we have no problem admitting that we're determined by many other causes and constraints in our lives. Um, I can't fly, and I mean, that's upsetting, but I learned to live with it, right? And I think I don't know that we are actually free. So like, it's kind of like if we add more things to the list of things that we're determined by, right? I don't see that in some way as more difficult to deal with. Maybe if we're still in a kind of existentialist way, really, really attached to the notion of freedom. But I think the obvious question is freedom for what? And obviously, Jung is partly going to give this system of hey, if we are being sort of unconsciously influenced by these archetypal forces, how could we become conscious of that? And that could be conceived as a liberating Promethean step toward freedom. But um, we also want freedom to participate in such forces, not to step outside of them or leave them behind necessarily. And so I don't feel compelled by that objection. It's like, the objection is what happens to our free will if we're determined by all these forces. And the same, I'm saying that what happens to our free will is the same thing that happened to our free will already, which is that we maybe never had it in the first place. And it's possible that Jung can help us to live, quote unquote, with more freedom. But I think we can challenge aside from that, we can challenge the value of freedom per se anyway, because it depends what we're free for. Okay, that was the third of six. Fourthly, if our lives can be understood through the study of prior causes, such as genetics, early conditioning, and the environment, how can astrology also influence our experience, given that there's no significant demonstrable causal connections between the planets and human beings? I think I don't really see that as a real objection. So the fact that we can't at the moment, I don't think framing it in terms of causation is the right way to go about that. And um, I think that cause and effect is sort of a maybe hangover from a combination of Newton and Kant that we maybe want to leave behind with the language of dynamical systems theory. So it may not be true to say that we're caused by anything, because who is it that's caused? Anyway, I don't think I want to dwell on that objection any longer, other than refer to what I already said. Fifth, how can the signs of the zodiac arbitrarily derived from a physically non-existent frame of reference and no longer in alignment with the constellations of stars after which they were named have any bearing on events and experiences on Earth? That's also a good objection. Um, the answer seems to be that certain constellations were over a long period of time imbued with archetypal forces, apparently, and that they have to be understood on those terms, which they have to be understood that way. It doesn't have to mean that what am I trying to say here? Like it's okay for things that have symbolic meaning to be arbitrarily derived, but it is a good objection. And hopefully Jung can help steer us through this. And just finally, astrology's apparent assumption of a geocentric rather than a heliocentric cosmology also seemingly places it at odds with the findings of science since the Copernican revolution. Although astrologers stress that adopting a geocentric perspective does not contradict the astronomical reality of a sun-centered solar system, but only symbolically reflects the vantage point of individuals on Earth. And yeah, I think like using the language of phenomenology can help us out of that one. There's no reason that from a phenomenological perspective of what it's like to be on Earth, that there's anything at odds with seeing things from the point of view of Earth at the same time as admitting that there is a a more sun-centered point of view, for example. Okay, so there are going to be a few other objections that come up in in Jung, but I want to jump to where that is. So it's quite a good book explaining all of this with, strong reference to what Jung actually said about this at different points in time. I'm going to draw from part four called Explanations of Astrology, which is actually a summary by Keiron Grice that puts together the 7 different ways that Jung approached the topic. Yeah, so introduction. Jung entertained multiple explanations of astrology. In the sections in part four, we witness the shifts in his position as they unfold in response to material he read and to his own reflections and research. To aid comprehension, his various hypotheses regarding astrology are placed into separate chapters. The commentary that follows offers some analysis of each hypothesis, drawing out the essential line of argument of the more complex theories. He pursues up to 7 possible explanations, some overlapping and some contradictory. So let's get into that. Number 1. Astrology can be understood in terms of the classical and medieval principles of the, quote, sympathy of all things and a microcosm-macrocosm correspondence. So in some ways, I find this one of the least interesting ways to approach it. To me, this is the as above, so below thing, which is like, to me, quite obvious and doesn't really say a whole lot. Um, but I'll read what Kieran Grice has to say about it. First of all, these ideas, considered in chapter 11, are extracted primarily from synchronicity and acausal connected principle, which surveys a range of related ideas that support an astrological conception of the world, including ancient Greek philosophical speculation from Hippocrates, Philo, and Theophrastus, from Plotinus, from Pico della Mirandola, and from alchemy and medieval natural philosophy, Zosimus, Paracelsus, Agrippa, and Divedus, and also Kepler. And so it's a kind of axiom of esoteric thought that the human being is a miniature version or reflection of the entire cosmos. The celestial heavens are deemed to exist within us all. Quote, heaven is infused into man, the microcosm. Similarly, classical and medieval thought posits bonds of sympathy, linking disparate parts of the universe in a grand system of correspondence, connecting the human world, human, worldly, and celestial. An idea captured by the statement as above, so below. This correspondence ultimately rests in the unity of God, or the anima mundi, or spiritus mundi, the world soul and world spirit, respectively. And so just to say what Jung has to say, Jung presents these perspectives as essentially as sort of essential background to his theory of synchronicity and to his research into astrology. Synchronicity, he notes, is a modern differentiation of the obsolete concept of correspondence, sympathy, and harmony. Especially significant for Jung was the classical and medieval belief, also present in Chinese thought, that there are connections between discrete events and experiences that are not causal, in that there is no apparent causal chain linking them. Rather, such conceptions or correspondences are deemed by Jung to be acausal, existing in parallel with each other and connected solely by meaning. Regarding astrology, for example, if one were to express anger and assertive force at a time when the planet Mars is aligned with the Sun, it would, on this view, not be due to any causal influence of the planet Mars, but on the meaningful coincidence of that planetary alignment with a psychological state or a constellation of archetypes in one's psyche. So pausing there, I think, yeah, I mean, there's pretty obviously a kind of correspondence between as above, so without, so below, or as within, so without. I think like we can approach that in the language of participatory knowing and agent arena dynamics. It doesn't have to be um, in terms of, as he said, the obsolete notions of correspondence, sympathy, and harmony. And I think like it's important to be able to approach synchronicity, but talking about it simply as and like talking about a causal connection certainly helps us to get out of the language of Newton and Kant in terms of standard cause and effect, right? Recognize that we don't necessarily need those. But yeah, I think talking about it only in terms of meaning makes us subject to self-deception in a way that is unwise. Like we can't just, um, I mean, the obvious point is maybe we can just find meaning in whatever we like. But I think that's probably more of a reflection of our lack of sources of meaning from, in a way, more reliable sources. But it's at least a beginning of angling more toward quote unquote a causal connection, and that like obviously meaning has a significance and we can maybe account for self-deception, particularly if, for example, it's a collective phenomenon rather than merely subjective, quote unquote. Anything else there? Yeah, and so we saw also how synchronicity is based on like it's occasional, right? But this idea is like what this is saying essentially is that there's a kind of a causal connection between what is regarded as being without and what is regarded as being within that is happening kind of all the time, and that shows up in, for example, movement of planets, or that points to it points to that. And that's kind of not synchronicity because we're going to talk more about what synchronicity is, but I'm going to maybe leave that explanation behind. So I think like elements of those classical and medieval worldviews can be recovered, but in a way, it also, like I said, like it seems rather obvious. It doesn't really seem to me to warrant the indication of the amount of meaning that is usually made of those connections. It's like I'm essentially saying, so what? Okay, second explanation. Astrology is a projection of the unconscious into the heavens. The practice of astrology might be understood as a symbolic system or perspective in which the planets represent the gods, that is, the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And I think like that's pretty obviously there's a lot of truth to that, but I think there's going to be pressure placed on Jung's notion of projection. And so to draw on some help here, I want to draw from von Franz, who is sort of talking about Jungian, and she wrote a book called Projection and Recollection in Jungian Psychology. So projection is not so much an illusion to be abolished, but a kind of misalignment in the process of participatory knowing. So projection is kind of archaic participation. It's a way of participating in the world that is in a way more unconscious or more implicit, and that one can move to a more explicit co-relationship between self and world by quote unquote withdrawing projection. I think part of reconciling this is just about how to approach like the standpoint. Either we're approaching it from the phenomenological standpoint, in which it seems as if we're projecting and then withdrawing, or if we approach it from a more ontological direction, then we see that there's a co-transformation of self and world that's happening at the same time. And so this is a way of preserving the phenomenological sense of projection while also acknowledging that we're not only projecting, we're actually being in more attuned or more aligned relationship between self and world or less. But it goes on, and I will read this in connection with astrology as projection. This second hypothesis, covered in chapter 12, is perhaps Jung's most consistent and oft-repeated position. Astrology, Jung claims, is a complete projected theory of human character. To a large extent, as we've already seen in part 3, Jung's led to the conclusion that astrology is projected psychology by the consideration of the phenomenon of the precession of the equinoxes. So, because the signs of the zodiac are no longer aligned with the constellations after which they were originally named, Jung reasons there's no physical basis to the alleged influence on the signs of the signs on human life. So what this is saying is that those constellations were originally sort of imbued with a certain meaning, and since that time they've actually moved. So there's no longer an alignment between like the physical zodiacal wheel and the constellations with their classical meaning. And Jung thinks of this as a reason why there's no physical influence and why, therefore, astrology is a projection. He said the same line of argument does not necessarily apply to the planets, of course. For these obviously possess a substantive physical existence, even though they exert no demonstrable causal influence on human life. So that argument was only concerned with the signs of the zodiac, and maybe doesn't apply to the planets, which leaves the open question of why are they a projection? So Grice says, Jung's concern here is primarily understanding the alleged influence of zodiacal signs and constellations. But it's conceivable that the zodiacal signs might be explicable as a form of projected psychology, while the astrology of the planets might be explicable in other terms. So maybe we're projecting just upon the stars, and the planets, there's something else going on with the planets. It's possible. Goes on. Generalizing from his reflection on the signs, Jung concludes that the source of astrological meanings is not from the cosmos, but from archetypes in the unconscious psyche. Again, the source of astrological meanings is not from the cosmos, but from the archetypes in the unconscious psyche, from the microcosm of the individual human being. So the thing here would be to say that the archetypes do not derive simply from the individual human being. They're actually principles that are structuring the order of the cosmos and psyche, that therefore show up in microcosmic and macrocosmic terms. And if we understand archetypes as like Platonic intelligibles or ideas as being close to the ground of reality, then it's sort of like the reason why there's not an influence from the planets onto humans is because both planets and humans are sort of structured by or ordered by these archetypes, which are actually ontologically prior or deeper in some way. So this is one way of doing it. That is, although astrologers might believe that the planets and signs are the determining factors shaping the human personality, what are taken to be celestial causes are really psychological ones. So this is obviously different here. This is the argument for projection is saying, hey, these causes originate within the human psyche. And I think if we understand archetypes as structuring both the quote unquote physical world and the human world, that we can see that the archetypes don't just come from within. We sort of participate in them in this transjective way. But this is arguing something else. So it says, just as alchemy is understood by Jung as a projection into the prima materia in the alchemical vessel of the psychological transformation process, occurring within the alchemist psyche, so astrology is seen as a projection of the qualities and traits of the human personality into the heavens. In both cases, the implication is that the alchemist and astrologer were working under something of a delusion. So there's obviously some truth to this. Over the centuries, in Jung's view, the increasing differentiation of the ego, the subject of experience, from the world as object made it possible to become more conscious of our psychological projections as we progressively left behind the primal condition of our participation mystique, in which there's no clear distinction between the internal world of thoughts and emotions and external happenings in the environment. Meaning that to the epistemologically naive mind, Jung believes that inner and outer blur, they're not adequately distinguished, and psychological reality is mistakenly construed as cosmology or metaphysical reality. This is a critique that Jung levels at theosophy, for instance. Modern science and psychology, Jung maintains, now enable us to recognize these projections for what they are and to withdraw them. Jung does not address how his view of astrology as projection meshes with his explanations in terms of synchronicity and acausal correspondences, nor does he attempt to reconcile projection with his numerous assertions that appear to contradict the Cartesian separation of the inner world of the human subject from the outer world, a premise on which the theory of astrology as projection depends. Yeah, so the reason that it's difficult here is because Jung's understanding of astrology as projection doesn't seem to line up with what he's saying about synchronicity, and also astrology as projection seems dependent on this Cartesian split between inner and outer, which we can't really maintain anymore. For example, Jung describes the unconscious as a, quote, field of experience of unlimited extent, and likens it to the, quote, atmosphere in which we live. As we see in chapter 17, he goes so far as to posit the existence of a psyche to cosmos, a cosmic psyche, and to connect the collective unconscious to the Platonic idea of an anima mundi, a world soul. If such speculations are accurate, it might be that the unconscious actually pervades the environment all around us and is not an encapsulated realm located exclusively within the individual, as we tend to assume. This implies, in turn, that archetypal meaning might be inherent to the universe itself and not restricted to a separate isolated psyche, projecting its meanings into the external world and into the heavens. Jung's reflections on the psychoid nature of the archetypes, discussed under points 6 and 7, also support this supposition. Okay, so what this is saying is the unconscious is not just within, it's also around us. It's extended through our world, right? And like I've talked about this in terms of the notion of 4E reensoulment. Yeah, and that's what I was kind of getting at by saying that the archetypes are in some way um, ontologically prior to either external physical or um, abstract subjective. So there's a way that the subjective, objective, abstract, and sensory are all grounded in the archetypal or symbolic layers of being that are in turn derived from what we could call the one in this context. So this is a sort of a later Jungian understanding of the notion of the unconscious, is that it's actually not just within us, but extended around us. This then puts pressure on the notion of projection, because we can't be maintaining this subject out object distinction. I think the way to understand this, like what is, because I mean, like I notice myself projecting and other people projecting. So what's really going on there? Well, we can understand rejection as a kind of misalignment or misattunement between self and world, where we derive meanings that are exaggerated or detached, disconnected in ways that may appear to be simply subjective, and then maybe not just subjective, but or maybe understanding them as subjective is not the best way to understand them, but we can understand them in terms of self-deception. So that's fine. But then, and like that clearly shows up in astrology, right? We clearly see people deriving the meaning that they simply want to find in a kind of confirmation bias way or affective bias, finding what we want to find. Like I think projection is a reasonable way of understanding that, but I also think that and like understanding the planets as gods or archetypes by means of projection is at least a way to start understanding what they are. But the point is that they're um, yeah, self-organizing, self-constituting phenomena that are not expressed or projected by humans. They're they're in here within the world, so to speak. But one might adopt projection as an explanation if one isn't comfortable with that. Yeah, but I think I'm more drawn to the later Jung here, which is not so dependent on Descartes and Kant, or not so dependent on Kant and through Kant, Descartes. And so in some way, this like we can understand the truth of saying, oh, it's just a projection in a different way. Perhaps, for example, the language of self-deception or misattunement between self and world, like where an agent is not well fitted to the arena, that kind of a route. And then, but if that's the case, then this gives us a very limited understanding of what astrology is. And so we're then seeking for further explanations, of which there are five that Jung offers. The third one, right, I'm going to try and get through the rest of this. So the third explanation, astrology is a mantic method, a means of divination in which astrological interpretations and predictions are forms of synchronicity, manifesting as meaningful lucky hits. In considering Jung's view of astrology as divination, Chapter 13 sets forth a rationale behind his astrological experiment and presents the conclusions he drew from it, despite the experiment's fatal errors in calculation, indeed because of these errors. Jung's experiment proposed to investigate whether there are statistically significant correlations between marriage and certain planetary configurations, formed between astrological birth charts of husband and wife in married pairs compared to unmarried pairs. As noted in the editorial comments within the chapter, although the results of Jung's astrology experiment ultimately concluded that correlations between the astrological factors and marriages were not statistically significant, initial errors were made in calculation, such that the data appeared at first to lend support to astrology. Jung took this susceptibility to error, distorting the results in favor of corroborating astrology as itself significant, and viewed it as a synchronistic occurrence through which the unconscious conspired to influence the outcome in line with the researcher's lively interests and personal investment in astrology. So in Jung's view, the synchronistic factors had produced something like an experimenter bias. Addressing this matter in Jung and Astrology, Maggie Hyde makes a helpful distinction between two different kinds of synchronicity, discussed in Jung's writing, which she terms synchronicity 1 and synchronicity 2. She describes the former, synchronicity 1, as the meaningful interdependence of events among themselves, emphasizing something like an, quote, objective pattern in the nature of in the nature of things, with synchronistic acausal correlations between the objective fact of the planetary positions and meanings or events observed in human experience. Okay. 2. The latter, synchronicity 2, emphasizes the subjective participation of the observing psyche, with synchronicity recognized as a significant factor in the subjective act of interpreting astrological meanings, much in the manner that Jung attributed to the mathematical errors in calculation in his astrology experiment to synchronicity, with the expectations and emotional state of the researcher unconsciously entangled with the calculation of the results. And so Hyde emphasizes that the astrologer cannot escape his or her subjectivity while reading the chart, and seeks to uncover meaning in the astrological configurations. What emerges as significant during any particular reading is guided by a synchronistic collusion between astrologer client and the astrological symbols. Okay. I'm going to read the end of this and then comment. Impressed by what had happened during his experiment, Jung was led to conclude that in the practice of astrology, a secret mutual connivance existed between the material and the psychic state of the astrologer. Astrology works in this view because of the astrologer's and the client's psychological investment and participation in the horoscope reading, with the emotionally charged context of the reading providing the necessary conditions for synchronicity to occur. Thus, even if the astrologer uses the wrong birth data, and therefore an incorrect astrological chart, the horoscope reading can still be valid, since astrology, the reasoning goes, depends not on accessing an objective order in the universe, but on the astrologer using chart symbols, unconsciously guided by synchronicity, as a way to divine the meaning of the moment. Synchronicity, too, therefore goes hand in hand with the view of astrology as divination. In this respect, casting a horoscope is similar to doing a reading with tarot cards, in which the unconscious similarly directs the selection of cards in answer to a question posed by the querent. Astrology, in the divinatory view, accesses the inner world of psychological meanings, functioning as a kind of symbolic mirror of the psyche, irrespective of whether there's an objective order to which astrological factors refer. Because all things can be read symbolically, it does not necessarily matter which particular astrological variables are used. For as Cornelius, Hyde, and Webster note, quote, every factor conceivable by an astrologer is capable of generating valid symbolism. Okay, Jung later referred to this synchronicity too as, quote, our narrower conception of synchronicity that, quote, needs expanding since it is restricted to specific exceptional incidents of the revelation of subjective meaning during astrology readings rather than constituting a general principle of consistent correspondence between human experience and an objective order in the nature of things. He comes to the conclusion that, quote, synchronicity in the narrow sense is only a particular instance of general acausal orderedness. Okay, so perhaps this distinction between two different kinds of synchronicity can help us. Synchronicity 1 seems to be something that's more going on all the time. This correspondence between self and world, I would understand that as being with reference to the extended nature of cognition. Whereas synchronicity 2 seems to refer to more revelatory or significant instances of individual meaning that pop up from time to time and that have more to do with using astrology as a kind of symbolic mirror. I mean, so astrology as divination is also that's obviously also deeply true. There's also deep truth to this, but I think it maybe needs to be debrided a bit from the subjective and objective split so that it's not conceived simply as projection. And then the question would be, can this be practiced in a way that downplays or like escapes self-deception? Like if we're to understand the tarot and the I Ching and astrology all as different forms of divination, then they all, according to Jung, would involve projection. Anyway, I'll leave that where it is and I say I think that there's truth to that, but that it's also not adequate. And I'll try and get through the rest. So number 4 goes, 4, there's a physical mechanism to explain astrology in the form of photon radiation. I'm actually going to skip this one because it's bullshit. There's so I won't go into photon radiation as like, oh, that's what's causing it. I think that's ridiculous. And if we ended up in a vibrational metaphysics, so um, the primacy of sound or the primacy of rhythm or vibration, that could go a long way to understanding the connection based on shared resonance. But we're nowhere near that point in terms of physics, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But if, Pythagoras makes a real revival, let's say, then it might become relevant in a few centuries. Okay, so that leaves 3 more. 6. Sorry, no, 5. Astrology depends on the qualitative significance of time. Time is not an empty frame of reference, as we commonly assume. For each unique moment possesses a certain quality, which astrological horoscopes symbolize. Okay, what does this mean? Quote, whatever is born or done at this particular moment of time, Jung declared, has the quality of this moment of time. He devotes considerable energy to articulating this view, especially in his seminars and writing from the late 1920s and 30s, which comprise many of the extracts included in Chapter 15. Jung argues that the astrological study of the movement of the planets in the heavens is a method of understanding the changing qualities of moments in time. This is also very, so there's also truth to that. I mean, the I Ching is about that. It's kind of 64 and then 384 because 6 times 64. Um, archetypal moments, like kinds of moments. So there is some truth to that. You know, at least if one understands the I Ching in some way. But then it goes on. So yeah, so Jung argues that the astrological study of the movement of the planets in the heavens is a method of understanding the changing qualities of moments in time. He employs something like the following line of argument, of which there are five statements. A, time is derived from the observation of the flux of things, of change in the universe. B, change is generated by the movement of energy, or the transformation of energy from one form to another. C, therefore time is an aspect of energy. D, astrology is an indication of the condition of universal energy at particular moments in time, functioning like a cosmic clock or watch, with the positions of the planets like the hands of a clock, indicating the state of things at a particular moment. E, fate is identical with time. To observe the movements of the planets as an indication of passing time is thus to observe fate as it fulfills itself. Okay, so Jung was arguing that. I think, yeah, I mean, time is obviously, an aspect of energy. I think that's pretty solid. But can there be archetypal moments? I think I'll just leave that where it is. It says, by the 1950s, however, Jung felt impelled to qualify his position, noting in a letter to André Barbault that he chose to replace the notion of the qualitative significance of time with the concept of synchronicity, which he develops more fully in the material presented in Chapter 17. Okay, so so the qualitative significance of time, according to Jung, ends up being subsumed within the notion of synchronicity, and that leaves two explanations which go into this a bit more. Number 6, this is a quite interesting one. Astrology rests on transcendental numerical archetypes, as in the Pythagorean and Platonic understanding of number as an a priori ordering principle. So what's this talking about? It says astrology has its foundation in the qualitative significance of number, in conjunction, Jung notes, with the numinous assemblage of gods, which the horoscope represents. For Jung, as in astrology, numbers are held not only to be instruments for counting and calculation, the quantitative aspect of number, but they're also thought to possess a universal symbolic meaning. The number 1, for example, implies unity and beginning. 2 is associated with duality and the tension of opposites. And 3 suggests harmony arising from the reconciliation of opposites. This kind of numerical symbolic logic runs throughout astrology. The 12 signs of the zodiac are derived from the qualities of number, generated by the subdivision over the 360 degrees of the zodiac. Similarly, the meaning of specific aspects, the geometric relationships between the planets, are also based on the meanings of the small whole numbers from which they're derived. The conjunction pertains to the number 1, the opposition to 2, the trine to 3, the square to 4, and so forth. Although he was initially concerned with the role of number as a psychological ordering factor in the unconscious, he called the number the archetype of order. His later reflections on the, quote, psychoid dimension of the archetype led him, as we read in his letters, towards a Pythagorean view of number as an ordering principle intrinsic to all of reality, both the inner world of the psyche and the external world, although he did not make this position explicit in his formal writing. Jung introduced the term psychoid in the 1950s to designate the tendency of the archetype at its deepest level to pass over from instinct into an organic substrate and to, quote, fall in with fundamental forms of the physical process in general. Quote, archetypes, he proposes, are not found exclusively in the psychic sphere, but can occur just as much in circumstances that are not psychic. Okay. In the selections in chapter 16, then Jung poses the question as to the relationship between number and, quote, something as archetypal as astrology. The answer, in terms of Jung's own statements, might be formulated as something like the following arguments, of which there are four parts. A, number is an archetypal ordering principle in the unconscious psyche. Quote, the unconscious uses number as an ordering factor. Numbers, quote, have an archetypal foundation. B, at its deeper levels, archetypes in the unconscious have a psychoid dimension, such that they also pertain to physical processes in the material world. Presumably then, this implies that numbers, as archetypes, also have a psychoid dimension. C, this supposition accords with Jung's assertion that, quote, number, like meaning, inheres in the nature of all things, which draws Jung close to a Pythagorean position, as he himself recognizes. Quote, the fact that the numbers pre-existing in nature are presumably the most fundamental archetypes, being the very matrix of all others. Sorry, the fact is that the numbers pre-existing in nature are presumably the most fundamental archetypes, being the very matrix of all others. Here, Pythagoras was certainly on the right track. And then D, it is possible, therefore, and this seems to be the implication of Jung's speculations on number, that astrology is based on a transcendental numerical order, manifest both in the psyche and in the universe at large. I think it's also clear that archetypes can be understood in those numerical and psychoid terms. Numbers as the deepest archetypes. Fascinating, right? There's also significant truth to that, it seems to me. Yeah, and so it seems like Jung's reflections on number should be considered alongside his views on synchronicity, which are explored here. So it says that was explanation 6, that was about number. And number 7, quote, astrology is a form of synchronicity, reflecting an acausal parallelism or correspondence between planetary positions and experiences in human life, partly explicable in terms of the psychoid nature of archetypes. Quote, focusing on synchronicity in general rather than astrology specifically, the hypothesis presented in chapter 17 is not explicitly applied by Jung to understand astrology, yet it constitutes what is arguably his most developed and sophisticated explanation of it. Arising out of and subsuming Jung's view of astrology as archetypal, synchronistic, and rooted in numerical forms is the idea that astrology might be explained in terms of a general acausal orderedness. Jung understands this as an underlying principle of arrangement and an a priori archetypal order in the nature of things, which stands behind specific instances of synchronicity. That would be synchronicity 1 in Hyde's scheme. As an example of synchronicity on a grand scale, astrology might conceivably be understood as the expression of this acausal orderedness, which Jung considers to be a, quote, all-pervading factor or principle in the universe. This position emerges from Jung's speculations on the intersection of depth psychology and physics, and from his reflections on the mind-matter relationship. Contemplating these questions also led him to posit the existence of a, quote, transcendental psychophysical background to the empirical world, and drew him close to the medieval notion of the unus mundus, one world, where there's no incommensurability between so-called matter and so-called psyche. The psyche and the cosmos are considered to be two related aspects of the unitary reality that is neither psychological nor material. Thus Jung says, quote, the common background of microphysics and depth psychology is as much physical as psychic, and therefore neither, but rather a third thing, a neutral nature, which can at most be grasped in hints, since its essence is transcendental. Complicated. So, proceeding further, Jung ventures to suggest that the archetypal background can be viewed as a, quote, potential world and as a, quote, universal factor existing from all eternity, which manifests itself in acts of, quote, continuous creation in time. That's quite Platonic. It stretches the limits of our comprehension to fully grasp Jung's intended meaning here, but he seems to be proposing that what is eternally present in the transcendental background of reality appears to us as a succession, as an ordered unfolding of the ground in a series of temporal moments, supporting specific synchronistic and acausal correlations between the psyche and cosmos, of which astrology is one form. Recalling here Jung's explanation of astrology in terms of the quality of time, we could say that astrology is an indication of the changing qualities of moments in time, might be used to map the unfolding of eternal archetypal reality of the, quote, potential world into a temporal sequence. Goes on. To summarize briefly then, this explanation of astrology depends upon the idea that there is a psychoid archetypal order, at a deeper dimension of reality, functioning as a kind of organizing principle of both the psyche and the cosmos. Hence Jung's enthusiasm in a letter of 1957 for the idea of a transcendental arranger behind acausal synchronistic correlations. If there is indeed such an organizing principle underlying psyche and the cosmos, it's conceivable that the physical configurations formed by the planets in the solar system might be organized according to the same transcendent numerical archetypes that also order and inform the collective unconscious, thereby helping to account for the relationship posited in some forms of astrology between planetary configurations and archetypes. Okay, that's helpful. It's like if the whole cosmos and psyche is ordered based on the same principles, then this is why certain planets appear as agglomerations of the archetypes, archetypal forces. Again, quote, if there is indeed such an organizing principle underlying the psyche and the cosmos, it's conceivable that the physical configurations formed by the planets in the solar system might be organized according to the same transcendent numerical archetypes that also order and inform the collective unconscious, thereby helping to account for the relationship posited in some forms of astrology between planetary configurations and archetypes. Okay, a little bit more. It says, such a view contradicts the idea that astrology might be wholly explained as an unconscious projection of the psyche into the heavens, for the observed correspondences between planetary configurations and activated archetypal themes in human experience could conceivably be better explained as a special kind of constant synchronicity based on the underlying order described earlier. So it's not just projection. We could maybe better explain it as constant synchronicity. Okay. What else does Keiron Grice have to say? A couple more paragraphs. Although speculative, this hypothesis perhaps constitutes the most coherent and comprehensive position emerging from Jung's engagement with synchronicity in astrology, one that's broadly in accord with certain perspectives in the, quote, new paradigm sciences. This hypothesis also has much in common with the classical and medieval explanations of astrology, point 1, covered in chapter 11. Jung does not further develop these reflections in relation to astrology. The material in chapters 17 and 16 on numerical archetypes represents the terminus, the end, of his exploratory thinking on synchronicity and by inference astrology. So, in concluding this overview of part 4, it should be stressed that in most cases, the various explanations summarized here, they are not mutually exclusive. At the basis of astrology, there could, for example, be an objective order of archetypal meaning inherent in the underlying structure of reality, and at the same time, projections of the unconscious into observed patterns in the heavens. Indeed, given the plethora of astrological techniques and variables employed today, with astrologers finding significance in their own preferred approaches, it's almost certain that projection shapes the interpretation of the celestial patterns symbolized in astrology. Equally, there are surely synchronistic elements at play in the subjective act of the interpretation of astrological charts, evident in those instances in which valid meaning is conveyed even when an astrologer inadvertently works with the wrong chart data. Whatever explanation of astrology one finds most compelling, what's most striking is just how many elements of Jung's theories and understanding of the psyche are pertinent to an astrological view of the world. Taking seriously the claims of astrology alongside the evidence of synchronicity led Jung to contemplate the deepest mysteries and fundamental questions of existence, such as the nature of space and time, the relationship between mind and matter, and the possibility of meaning existing outside of human consciousness. That he was not able to provide conclusive explanations of astrology is, in the face of these great mysteries, entirely to be expected, although his speculations present rich possibilities for further theoretical elaboration. Okay, thank you, Keiron Grice. And I found the Pythagorean stuff to be the most compelling. I think understanding the physical and abstract world and the objective and subjective world in terms of archetypal reality is pretty sound in terms of in terms of the role of the imaginal and the grounding nature of symbols. And I can totally imagine that numbers as some of the deepest archetypes are a kind of ordering principle, structuring those different sort of branches of reality. Yeah, and I think as those archetypes structure the cosmos and the psyche, yeah, studying the relationships between planets and the quote unquote collective unconscious or human experience is simply a way to converge on the underlying reality of archetypal forces. And I think we do ultimately want to get out of a dualism, which does imply a unity of psyche and cosmos. But I think I mean, we still need to understand astrology in terms of um, projection and in terms of divination. They're both helpful. And I think, I don't think I'll comment further about synchronicity here. But as you said, they're not mutually exclusive explanations. So that might do.